go now to where we began the show at the top, which was a little bit of discussion about Michael Flynn and the saga there with lots of different developments that are happening. There's also this topic of Richard Burr, senator from North Carolina, served an FBI warrant last night. It appears maybe they took a cell phone, what have you. We'll talk a little bit about that and more with John O'Connor, author of Postgate, How the Washington Post Betrayed Deep Throat, Covered Up Watergate, and Began Today's Partisan Advocacy Journalism. John served as an assistant U.S. attorney in North Carolina from 1974 to 1979 and was Deep Throat's lawyer when Deep Throat went public. John O'Connor, welcome to Jimmy at the Crossroads.
Hey, Jimmy, how are you?
You know, I'm doing pretty well. How about you?
Well, let me give a shout out first to Mark Cuban. This is odd, but I represented Don Nelson as Mark's very friendly opponent in litigation when Don, who was coach of the Mavericks, and Mark got into litigation. That said, Don thinks Mark was one of the best owners he's ever encountered. He was way ahead of his time, and young Donnie Nelson is his GM now. So they're good friends, but we had a real tussle there for a while. That's why I say, and Mark and I had some fun together. Let me just say that.
I love that connection. We didn't have any indication of that when we brought you on, but hey, there we go. And by the way, he just seems like such a class act. That was fun. I know you were watching some of the interview. What'd you think?
Oh, Mark is brilliant. I'm a private enterprise guy. I would say do everything that Mark says, but do it through private companies. Mm-hmm. I much more trust them. And if there is a success in the venture, it will be privately owned and people can take private ownership. It's very hard once something is taken over by government. It's very hard to disattach it.
Yeah. And
maybe I'm a little cynical like you are, but government just doesn't work as a profit-making enterprise and an efficient one. I think Adam Smith proved it in 1776, and things haven't changed.
That he did. I love quoting Adam Smith here on Jimmy at the Crossroads as well, but it's such an important point. We've seen decades of government failures. You look at the Great Depression when we did try these kinds of jobs programs, and that didn't turn out so well. I would argue that the New Deal prolonged the Great Depression. But while I would love to talk more about economics and liberty with you, I was particularly wanting to dive into the topic of Michael Flynn. I mean, now you got Judge Sullivan in the case, looking to a third-party guy, another judge, a retired judge, to give him advice on how to proceed on an uncontested motion to dismiss this case. John O'Connor, you were a federal prosecutor, you're a defense attorney, you're a civil litigator. Tell me about your thoughts on where things are at in the case in particular right now.
Well, first of all, just to shorthand, I think this prosecution of Flynn was about the most unethical thing I've ever seen. There's so many things wrong with it. It would take probably several of your shows to talk about them all. But suffice it to say, Barr is right on. This is dirty from start to finish. Every ethical norm was violated. Normally, if the government asked to withdraw a guilty plea in the interest of justice because there's been misconduct, the judge would grant it. Now, does he need to do it? I think he's checking that now. I don't think he needs to do it. I think it's up to his discretion. And you have a little bit of wrinkle because there was a delegation of powers to a special counsel. Now, the entity that is asking for the relief is not the special counsel himself. That said, Judge Sullivan is looking to Watergate for precedent. Watergate is not precedent because in that case, you didn't have rules and regulations. The Attorney General gave everything over to the special counsel and said, I'm keeping my hands off. In this case, in modern day, a special counsel is governed by rules and regulations which require that they adhere to government, Justice Department rules and regulations, and that the Justice Department still has oversight authority on a special counsel. That's the distinction between here and Watergate. That Department of Justice has said, we're exercising our oversight. We think this prosecution stinks from top to bottom. Now, that said, if I was a betting man, I'm saying that Judge Sullivan is looking closely at whether or not he's going to deny this motion. So
Yeah.
I'm in Flynn's camp,
Well,
but if Judge Sullivan wants to do it, I think he can do it.
well, sure. The thing is that, and I think Professor Jonathan Turley pointed this out, that it seems like the judge is looking everywhere he can to find some justification not to dismiss this case. And whatever it is, he's bringing in a retired judge, even though there's an uncontested motion. He's doing pulling out all the stops, as it were, to try to make this the inevitable outcome, which is deeply concerning when if you're worried about civil liberties, not just now, but in the future.
Well, that's right. That's right. That's what he's doing. There has been so much evidence and argument put forth by Burr that shows that this thing stinks. Judge Sullivan is going the opposite way, and he's trying to build up his own coalition to say, no, here's the reason I'm not going to dismiss this thing. He's an interesting cat, Judge Sullivan. He definitely dances to his own drum. I predict that he's going to deny the motion. I don't think it's right, but he can do it. I think he's got the discretion. The only thing that I think the government has in its arrow in its quiver is this Brady versus Maryland issue, in which the government has determined that exculpatory information was not turned over to the defense. That's such a pure legal issue that I think that the appellate courts can overrule Judge Sullivan if they are so inclined. Normally, this thing is clearly a matter of discretion with the lower court, and normally that's not touched. That discretion is not overturned. But at least Burr has a hook to hang his hat on if Sullivan rules against him. So the thing may not be over.
I don't think it is.
Sullivan rules.
By no stretch of the imagination do I think Bill Burr, Attorney General, who I think has done an extraordinary job in that position and is a very savvy lawyer, I don't think there's any chance that he's going to let this go. John O'Connor, former federal prosecutor, author of the book Postgate, our guest here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Let's talk for a moment about how this investigation all came about, because that's what's so stunning. Now we hear about this unmasking situation with 39 Obama administration officials, including Vice President Joe Biden and President Obama, wanted Michael Flynn to be unmasked. We have seen this meeting in January 5th, 2017, just before Trump took office, where Sally Yates, then Deputy Attorney General, and James Comey and President Obama were in the Oval Office, and Sally Yates was stunned as Obama was asking Comey questions about this investigation that she had no idea about. And then, of course, you had the January 24th meeting, the now infamous meeting with the FBI agents and Michael Flynn that brought us to this point. Kind of walk us through how we got here and what disturbs you the most about it, John O'Connor.
Well, what disturbs me the most is, and I've written about this, and some of this is the result of partisan journalism, the Russian collusion investigation itself was a blatant abuse of power. And there were there's a lot of wrongdoing there. Let's put it that way. It was a phony entrapment investigation. They did everything wrong there. And they had to get rid of Flynn before he hit them. They knew, in terms of the incoming administration, there was one guy who knew where all the bodies were buried and knew that this Russian investigation was phony. And that's General Flynn. And so that's why there was so much unmasking. The unmasking itself was not illegal, but it's an indication of wrongful intent, in my view. There was no real legitimate reason for 37 unmaskings other than a bunch of people trying to get this guy. Now, that's number one. So some of this was a cover-up for a phony investigation. Now, second cover-up, January 5th in the Oval Office, Obama and all the national security people, Susan Rice, James Comey, John Brennan, the whole crew, Joe Biden, they're all there. And according to Susan Rice's memo, the subject of the investigation was whether and to what extent they were going to give the incoming national security team of Trump all the information about their Russian collusion investigation. Now, wait a second. Why is that even an issue? Why would you be talking about whether and to what extent you're going to give information when you have to? And remember this is not a normal criminal investigation in which the Attorney General can keep things from the president or keep things at his discretion from other government agencies investigating. This is a counterintelligence investigation. The commander-in-chief is in charge of the counterintelligence investigation, aided by his national security team. It's a national security matter, and so they're meeting in the office of the Oval Office to determine to what extent they're going to obstruct the investigation that should be President Trump's and his national security team. In other words, they had the investigation, and we're not going to give them all the information. That's obstruction that makes Richard Nixon's obstruction look like child's play. You know, Nixon kept things from the Attorney General, the FBI, there's no doubt about it. Some things about the Mexican money trail was the main thing he did. It was a very minor thing, but it was a crime. Now, they're keeping from the president and his counterintelligence investigation information. Now, all of which they kept from him, I'm not sure, but it's pretty clear they kept an awful lot of it from him. Comey is still playing cat and mouse with Trump after Trump gets in office. He's not telling him the whole story. That started on January 5th. All this thing was a partisan conspiracy, mainly to cover up. You know, they'd already run a phony investigation. They got rid of Flynn. They were getting rid of Flynn. And now they're going to hide things from Trump and try to continue to go after Trump while he's in office. So there's so much dirt here, it boggles the imagination.
It is so abundantly obvious that this was a political prosecution from start to finish, political investigation. There was no sufficient predicate to investigate Michael Flynn in this way, contrary to what Andy McCabe and others are trying to say on CNN. John O'Connor, again, our guest, author of the book Postgate and former federal prosecutor. Unmasking, let's talk about that for a moment and kind of wind down the discussion of Michael Flynn. And I want to ask you briefly about Richard Burr. Define or describe what unmasking is and why we should be concerned about that.
Well, all these counterintelligence investigations are violations of the Bill of Rights. They're okay if it deals with foreign powers and foreign intelligence. Abraham Lincoln could free the slaves, even though it was unconstitutional, for national security purposes. So that overrides the Bill of Rights. That said, you shouldn't, if you unmask, you are now allowing the fruits of the search to be used against a citizen, not a foreign country. So you have to be very, very delicate when you do that. It should be for a legitimate national security purpose and not just to get your political enemies and not to prosecute them in some criminal action. So this is a misuse of the unmasking authority. It's not strictly prohibited by statute because it gives officials discretion, but it's dirty. It's dirty from start to finish. And so what I would say about the unmasking, Jimmy, is it is indicative of criminal intent. It is not in itself criminal. It's indicative. You're only doing this in order to get him and use this unmasking for a wrongful purpose. And that wrongful purpose is we've seen it carried out. The guy's convicted of a crime.
Let's play cut two, because the number one thing in my mind that strikes this as being troublesome is the fact that you have someone like Vice President Joe Biden, former Vice President Biden, involved as one of the individuals who was trying to get Michael Flynn's identity unmasked. Let's play cut two here, which is Biden on Sunday saying, "Oh, I only knew that they asked for an investigation."
I do want to ask you about Michael Flynn, the former national security advisor to President Trump, and the move by the Justice Department last week to dismiss the case against him for lying to the FBI. The president said yesterday that that move is justified because President Obama targeted Flynn. He called it, quote, the biggest political crime in U.S. history. Your former Senate colleague Charles Grassley has added that Flynn was entrapped and asked on the Senate floor, what did Obama and Biden know? When did they know it? So what did you know about those moves to investigate Michael Flynn, and was there anything improper done?
I know nothing about those moves to investigate Michael Flynn, number one. Number two, this is all about diversion.
I do want to press that. You say you didn't know anything about it, but you were reported to be at a January 5th, 2017 meeting where you and the president were briefed on the FBI's plan to question Michael Flynn over those conversations he had with the Russian ambassador Kislyak.
No, I thought you asked me whether or not I had anything to do with him being prosecuted.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I was aware that they asked for an investigation, but that's all I know about it, and I don't think anything else.
All he knew was that they were trying to get an investigation, John O'Connor. Yet we know that's not true now, do we?
Right. Right. What I think Biden was worried about was what Flynn knew as well. Remember, these guys had to get Flynn before they got him. And Flynn not only knew where the bodies were buried on Russia, he knew where they were buried on Ukraine. If there's anybody around who knew about Ukrainian corruption, and it's more than just Biden's firing the prosecutor, that's a minor deal compared to the 1.8 billion he gave to the oligarchs who were represented by his son. But he was worried about Flynn, and so when you unmask, you get all the conversations that Flynn has engaged in. And when you do that, I think Biden was interested in his own hide there. So he's dirty too. The only thing I'd say about Joe is that maybe he's a taco or so short of a combination plate, and it's pretty hard to prosecute a guy that's not with it like he is.
Yeah.
Let me put it that way.
I think that is a nice way of putting it, John O'Connor. All right, let's shift gears here, and I appreciate your analysis there. Just a couple more minutes with you. Again, John O'Connor, author of the book Postgate, former federal prosecutor. North Carolina Senator Richard Burr had a warrant served for a search warrant yesterday, last night appears, and it may be the case that his cell phone was taken by the FBI, according to some reports. It looks like as well that this is all tied to the notion of insider trading, that he attended this briefing, I think, in January about coronavirus, and then he went out in public and said there's nothing to be concerned about, was very clear on that, yet meanwhile he was selling stock in companies and buying new stock in other companies relative to this crisis and what he saw was going to be coming to fruition. What do you think's going on here?
Well, there are a couple people that sold stock, a couple other people, but they have pretty legitimate defenses, so to speak. The government shouldn't be preventing them from the regular trading of stocks. I think the Georgia Congresswoman has a decent defense. I think Dianne Feinstein might have sold some. Again, looks pretty innocent. Burr, it doesn't look so good for him. And I got to say,
why is that?
It looks to me like he traded inside information and did exactly what he shouldn't do. He was front running the general public. I didn't know what he knew. And if I wanted to sell my stock, I wouldn't have the same information. So it's not fair. I got to say, I hope he didn't do it. I hope he has a defense, but it doesn't look good to me. And you're right, Jimmy. Precisely what they want to get is something like the cell phone, because the only question here is his intent, his criminal intent, like I'm talking about, the unmasking evidence. They're looking for some indication that the reason he sold that stock was the information he learned from these briefings. If they can get his cell phone records, if they can find his broker, whoever it is that will have his own records, perhaps they can link that knowledge to the sale of the stock. Yeah. Otherwise, they know he has a defense in which he's saying, I never liked this stock anyway.
Yeah. Well, and one thing too, though, is that there was at least, I think, one recording or at least a meeting where he had with some high-level donors or something of the sort, and he gave them a more honest perspective that there's real reason to be concerned about this. So he was telling certain limited folks that could get access to him, and he had the information himself and was acting in accordance with that. While in, I think, an op-ed as well as on TV news and so forth, he was saying there's nothing to worry about.
Well, there you go. That's pretty good evidence of intent.
Yeah.
And in that call to his donors, if he does talk in any way, especially about the effect on the markets, that to me will be a huge tell. For his sake, I hope he didn't do that, but for the prosecutor's sake, I think that's pretty darn good evidence.
Let me
and
ask.
He was not telling the truth to the public. So, and that's okay to say you want to keep the public calm if you think that's the right thing, but you shouldn't be buying and selling stock on that basis.
Let me ask you one final question, John O'Connor, the role of criminal intent, because I think in particular during the impeachment stuff that the Democrats were trying to do, especially the one where they actually moved forward and brought it to a trial in the Senate, they seem to be discounting any indications of whether or not criminal intent was necessary to demonstrate. When we're talking any of these sorts of cases of law, or even in the case of impeachment, where they're trying to say, oh, he broke the law in some way, what is the role and significance of criminal intent, and how do you determine that?
Well, it's everything. I told people when I was a prosecutor that the hardest thing in the world to do in a white-collar case is you have to prove criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt to a unanimous jury. And so what prosecutors would do, and they do it now, is there's an instruction that says you can't look inside somebody's head and pull out his software. They don't say that. The instruction says you can't look inside somebody's head. So you got to look at all the facts and circumstances to determine intent. So I think in the case of Burr, I think you've got some evidence of intent, and that's precisely what the FBI is looking for. In Trump's situation, I think intent was also at issue. It isn't a strict liability crime if the guy, I don't know what particular crime they were looking at, but if a guy's innocent and does something that is objectively wrong, that's not criminal. You and I and other people do things wrong all the time or mistaken about a fact. That doesn't mean we're trying to commit a crime. So you got to look at intent. And that's why, getting back to the Flynn thing, the unmasking is such powerful evidence in my view, because it starts the chain of criminal intent on Flynn. And there's a lot of criminal intent here involved. All these discussions, and of course Peter Strzok has given us a treasure trove with his text message.
Make no mistake about that. So much that they actually made a play of Strzok and Page, which was pretty entertaining. If you haven't seen it, it's on YouTube. Look it up. All right, John O'Connor, check out his book, Postgate, How the Washington Post Betrayed Deep Throat, Covered Up Watergate, and Began Today's Partisan Advocacy Journalism. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really good insights.
Jimmy, it's been a blast.
Same here. Thank you, sir. Once again, John O'Connor joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, former federal prosecutor, now private attorney. You just watched a clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. Don't miss more engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel today. You want to catch our live show. And I love your support.
I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.